Now that's a perfect steak! A few weeks ago, Cytron announced the Raspberry Pi Pico Maker Party, where you get to enter a project using one of their maker boards for a chance to win prizes. It's been some time since I last made an electronics project, and I was interested in joining. At the same time, I've been trying to cook different kinds of recipes and experimenting with them, so I thought, why not combine the two? I can make a project for the RPI Pico Maker Party that can help me increase the variety of my cooking. What was the project? It's the DIY Sous Vide tool. Sous vide is a method of cooking where food is vacuum packed in a sealed bag and then immersed in a strictly temperature-controlled water bath. I first tried to decide which maker board I'll be using for the project. The MakerPi RP 2040 was interesting, but ultimately wasn't fit for what I wanted to do, as it was focused more on servos and motors. Next, I considered the Maker Nano RP 2040 and the MakerPi Pico Mini. They were very small and easy to prototype with, given the JST-SH connectors built in. The MakerPi Pico Mini also had the Wi-Fi variant, which was handy because that means I won't need to use a separate Wi-Fi coprocessor. In fact, when I was testing out components for the project, I used the MakerPi Pico Mini with a pre-soldered Pico W for prototyping, but more on why I need Wi-Fi in a minute. In the end, I wanted to also add logging and some sound effects. My prototype already looks like a rat's nest with the amount of wires to be managed, and I didn't want to add more just to connect an SD card module and a buzzer. So I chose the MakerPi Pico Base with a Pico W, since it already came with the SD card module and the buzzer soldered in. Working with the MakerPi Pico Base was really a breeze because of the Grove ports. It really lessened the amount of time I needed to solder headers or make my own power and ground buses. All I needed was to plug in the Grove connector to the port, and I have all 4 wires I needed: 3.3 volts, ground, and GPIO, which could be I2C, 1-wire, or rotary encoder signals. I then decided on a few features: a rotary encoder for setting the target temperature, a display to show information, and a waterproof temperature probe to take the temperature of the water bath. After confirming that all the modules I wanted to use are working, I then created a rough schematic in KiCad to help me wire things up later. I had a few extra features in mind. I wanted it to be battery powered. I wanted to be able to charge a battery. I wanted to be able to turn on and off the whole thing, and I wanted to run a water circulator off the device. I added those to the schematic as well. Now, remember why I mentioned I needed Wi-Fi? That's because working with mains power is dangerous and it can kill you. I'm serious about this. If you don't know what you're doing, please do not play with mains power. However, my idea was to turn on or off a hot pot depending on the temperature, and a hot pot runs on mains power. In order to work safely with mains power, I got another device, the Sonoff S26, which is a Wi-Fi enabled plug. With the hot pot plugged into the Sonoff, I am able to turn on or off the hot pot through Wi-Fi and without actually having to wire anything or even remotely touch mains power. Yay! I needed to prepare the Sonoff first though. In order for it to be able to receive custom commands, I flashed Tasmota onto the Sonoff microcontroller. After confirming that the Sonoff is able to get an IP address from my network, the last piece clicks into place, and all that's left is to assemble everything. At first, I wanted to use the ice cream container I was using to prototype things in, but it quickly became crowded with wires. Then I had the idea of using the Cytron box that came with my delivery orders. These boxes are actually quite nice and sturdy, and using them as a project box actually looks quite nice and really gives it that DIY look. Now that the hardware is done, the software is next. I looked for the recommended programming languages for the Raspberry Pi Pico and found that CircuitPython is good for beginners. It was my first time writing Python, much less CircuitPython, but it was fun to learn along the way. In the end, I ended up with something very similar to an RTOS application with multiple concurrent jobs running and managing peripherals and tasks like temperature control. I was able to finally cook a really juicy and delicious medium-rare ribeye steak, and I've been experimenting with other food like sausages, as well as eggs like the so-called onsen tamago. With that said, I hope you learned something from my project. I had really good fun with the whole process, and I learned a lot about CircuitPython and PID control theory. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to post them or send me a message. See you next time!